this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream. Here we are in Central Texas, at least 3 of the 4 of us in Central Texas, taking stock of what just happened in the legislative session that concluded yesterday. We're going to talk about that today, not just for people who live in Texas, but for all of you tuning in from outside Texas, because there are some serious implications of what happened and didn't happen in this legislative session for you and your states, and also in the nation's capital. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts, CEO of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, privileged to serve as the host of this weekly broadcast, and even more so, privileged to count our 3 guests this week as friends. You will soon know that you're in great hands today when it comes to getting analysis from these 3 gentlemen I'll introduce shortly. Our purpose today is to give you an objective, no holds barred assessment of what occurred in this legislative session, to give you a sense of which topics might be on special sessions, plural, in Texas, and why that matters, even if you don't live in the great state of Texas. So without further ado, let me say just from the top, it's just a great honor here, the first day of June, to have with me on this live stream my good friend, longtime colleague, Dr. Derek Cohen, Vice President of Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Also, good friend, Mr. Russ Vought, recently concluded a wonderful tenure as Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump administration, and now is President of the Center for Renewing America, which he'll tell us about. And a longtime friend in DC and Austin and throughout Texas, someone who understands Texas policy and politics and the legislature extremely well, Mr. Tyler Norris. So each of these gentlemen will give us their sort of quick assessment of what happened and did not occur in the legislature that just concluded. We're going to start with you, Derek Cohen, for kind of a high-level look at not just TPPF priorities, but really priorities for Texans and Americans that got across the finish line, and a few, as we will discuss, that didn't quite make it there. Why don't you take it from here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. The top level analysis is, very fitting with this particular panel. This panel's called More Texan Than Ever, and I think that was the animating principle of this legislative session. Whether it was the civics bill, whether it was making Texas a sanctuary state from some of the more gum-grabbing impulses of the Obama administration, all these things were accomplished alongside omnibus CPS reform. All this was accomplished coming in under population growth plus inflation, $4.3 billion under population growth and plus inflation, to be specific. And that being said, we are finding new ways to do what it is that makes Texas, Texas. We're finding new ways of offering healthcare coverage. One of the things that we've worked on this session was getting all these alternative forms of healthcare coverage through and getting those to a place where it's workable for families. So again, the top level analysis is Texas carved out its own solution in problems that plague many states.
Yeah, that's well said, Derek. And I'll just underscore, without trying to go through the exhaustive list of legislative wins, that in the 32-year history of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, not just for the priorities that our organization has, but the priorities of the conservative movement in Texas, this was an extremely productive session. We'll let other groups and other people decide what other adjectives they want to use, but the legislature got a lot done. That was, to be candid, largely overshadowed by what happened late Sunday night when a group of Democrats decided to show their backsides and abandon their posts, ignore the outcome of elections, which delivered a majority of people who supported election reform in Texas, and threw a real wrench in what we believe was the top priority for the legislature. So they adjourned yesterday, not having gotten across the finish line the big election reform bill. I'm sure the 4 of us will talk about that some. By saying that it was the most productive session up to that point, we're not ignoring the reality that it's a huge disappointment, if not an embarrassment, that didn't get done. But we're also very optimistic that not only will they come back in a special session, but they're going to deliver the best election reform bill in the history of the world as a result of the childishness of those members walking out. All that to say, there are national implications from this, and Russ Vought, more than anyone, I think, could give us a real good analysis of what happened and didn't happen in Texas and the consequences of that on a national scale. Russ, I'm going to pitch it to you, but thanks so much for making time out of your busy schedule to join us.
You bet. Well, thanks everyone for letting me be on this this live stream. And obviously, you know, from a national perspective, we look at Texas very closely from the standpoint of just the size of the state, the importance of it, the perception that it is one of the most conservative states, certainly of its voting base, but also the leaders that have been elected over several cycles. And so it's incredibly important. And so, you know, to the extent that Texas was able to pass a legislation like banning state-sanctioned racism in the form of critical race theory, a very big reflection of the national debate that that is being had right now on that issue. But also, I would say the importance of, you know, where we are nationally. I think if you try to think from a strategic standpoint, we have a left administration. You have Congress that's very tight but controlled by the left. And if you're trying to legislate and strategize on the basis of the fact that the hour is late in this country, where do you go? And the only really way you want to go from winning and messaging big national issues, but you want to create red sanctuaries that allow for good public policy to be passed as model legislation for the rest of the country, but also provide people hope in the midst of a national battle between right and left on these issues. And so people are looking to places like Florida, and Florida's great successes. Ron DeSantis is doing wonderfully on that point. But you're also looking to other states like Texas and others in the South that are also legislating. And I think the mood of the national citizen, the national patriot, the national conservative is trying to find legislatures, governors who we call it, who know what time it is, who are not saying, you know, well, we're going to focus only on economic issues, but realize that we are also need to fight on the cultural issues where the Democrats, the left, is coming at us most aggressively and have for some time. And so the way that I would look at this session of Texas is progress. Certainly the CRT bill was passed. There was a reflection even that the election integrity didn't get done, that was an outrage. And so that it required an immediate calling for a special session. You may not have seen that in the past because it is consistent with the national mood of where conservatives are on what the important issues are to be working on. Constitutional carry was another one of a lot of work went into being done that. But I would say that part of the challenge that I think Texas has is there's an expectation that it should be better, and an expectation that it should be leading, and that as activists, we shouldn't have to work as hard to get the attention of the leadership to be able to get this thing through a committee or onto the floor, or making sure some last minute point of order isn't successful in the House of Representatives, or a last minute amendment is added to the critical race theory bill, that we don't have to go back and fix it in the special session. And I'm referring in this case to an overly broad language with regard to civics being taught. So I would say from the national implications, which is what Kevin asked me to talk about, great hope, great, you know, we're certainly not moving backwards. We're moving in the right direction. But the level of leadership that Texas has with regard to the rest of the country looking to it is high. And our hope is that over time, we don't have as much fits and starts as we move forward, to be able to make sure that we get everything down on the agenda and not just the big stuff that people are looking to us. Because right now, and to be honest with you, if we're going to be successful as a country, it's not going to just be Florida. It's going to be Texas. It's going to be every red state out there creating a red sanctuary that allows us to battle the Biden administration with everything we've got. So I'm thrilled that there's going to be a special session coming up. From a standpoint of what we do, the Center for Renewing America exists to take the America First fights that President Trump fought on in the last 4 years and continue those into the future, realizing that for many, many years, no one was really working on these issues to make sure that on these cultural issues, and I define cultural broadly, it's not just your social issues, although it is, that it is those cultural issues of guns, of family, of community, to make sure that those are the ones that we define the agenda on first and foremost, because those are the ones that, for the most part, have been left at the drawing room floor. These are the issues that get you disinvited from the dinner table, and unfortunately, those are the ones that we have to work on the most. And I'll give you just an example that didn't get done. You're seeing bills in other states as it pertains to the contagion of transgender ideology in our schools and our cultural institutions. These are incredibly difficult bills to pass for politicians who don't ever want to do anything that goes against the LGBT community. But in reality, this is about protecting children, protecting individuals' rights of conscience. And so when you have a governor like Asa Hutchinson who stands up and says, I'm going to veto this bill to get rid of transgender healthcare, which is nothing more than not reflecting biological reality and protecting children, because the health community has been bullied into submission by LGBT activists for decades. That is, and saying as an excuse that that's a cultural issue, that's what we need to be against. We need to be for passing, in the midst of that political opposition, these kinds of common sense cultural bills that will protect the country and protect Texas and make it a red sanctuary. So, very pleased to report on some progress that you all have been seeing, since you're largely from the state of Texas. But it comes from the place that Texas has in the national consciousness that it has to be on the forefront of these issues. So hopefully, Kevin, I gave you what you're asking for.
Oh man, A plus, Russ Vought. No surprise there. In fact, I'm grateful that you would join us, because from your perch in DC, although you understand that places outside DC are more important, you've seen a lot. You've seen a lot of ideas come and go. You understand what leadership is required, and I think the point is it's particularly poignant for you sitting outside Texas to report on the good that has happened as a result of the legislative session, but also what I will take as a bit of a soft warning that we ought really not have to work quite as hard as we all do in order to get some of the reforms that we have. There's an assumption outside Texas that it's easy. And those of us, Derek and Tyler, know this better than anyone practically. There's an assumption that it's easy, and it just isn't. And it should be easier. Case in point is the election bill that failed. Case in point is that in Florida today, Governor DeSantis did sign a bill outlawing boys from playing in girls' sports. We couldn't even get that to the governor's desk in Texas. It requires much more courageous leadership than what we've seen in the conservative movement. And I'm hopeful that the special sessions plural, become opportunities for our leaders of the conservative movement in Texas to realize it. Tyler, Norris, that was a long-winded way of setting up a platform for you, because I have a little bit of an idea of what you're going to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, perfect. I couldn't do a better job listing all of the things that we should be talking about today than Russ and Derek did, and yourself. I just hope to provide some insight. This is my 7th session. I worked for 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate, have been outside for 3. And I would call myself an observer. If they're going late into the night, I'm going to watch it, no matter how mundane or inane or what other word you want to use about what they're doing. I'm going to watch it because I'm a sucker for procedure and stuff like that. And I've gotten to observe how the 2 chambers have changed or stayed the same over the last 7 sessions. And I hope to speak to how and why we got here. Why did things end up the way they are? And it speaks to having the political courage or the procedural know-how to deal with a difficult issue in 2 chambers that are extremely different. I think it was about a month, maybe 6 weeks ago, that a lot of the state's press and observers started to ask, well, how is this? Clearly the House and Senate are headed for a bit of a showdown on a lot of issues. How is this going to shape up? And I commented that if the two chambers were ships or airplanes in a dogfight, something like that, the Senate is going to be a lot more maneuverable. If there are 18 people in the Senate that want to do something and the lieutenant governor, they can bend space and time in any way that they want to say anything that they want, and they can do it within 10 minutes. And they did that multiple times. I believe it was the election integrity bill or some other related, that maybe it was critical race theory, where they took that bill and agreed, the 18 Republicans, sometimes with one Democrat add-on, the lieutenant governor agreed, whatever it is we did 6 weeks ago, we actually didn't do that, we did this. And so there's the new reality for everyone. And so, we think of a Senate, it kind of harkens back to the Romans or whatnot. We think of it as a dustier, stodgier place where people kind of stare through their monocles at whatever policy decisions are being made from a more populist house. And that couldn't be further from the truth here in Texas. The Senate here is very nimble. It can do whatever it wants, and it certainly did whatever it wanted to earlier than the House happened to most of the times on these issues, except for constitutional carry and a couple others. So that's how we got here. That's how that bottleneck in the House developed, where there's a lot more, believe it or not, procedure and rules and points of order, things that can stop good legislation or bad legislation in its tracks. And then I'll definitely want to talk about the good of where we're at right now in places like the Texas House. Certainly we had our problems with election integrity. We had our problems on the evening that they passed the critical race theory bill. That had a lot of amendments added to it that maybe substantively didn't do too much to the policy, but that was a difficult birthing process, to say the least, on that bill. But there were other really good things happening. On CPS and family issues, we seem to really be able to do things at our leisure in the Texas House, thanks to Rep. James Frank and some others who can really speak to those issues and have worked on them for a long time. A lot of wins when it came to, let's just call it, messing with the city of Austin. I mean, the last year in this city have been a complete disaster. If I moved my computer right over here, you could see out this window. I watched the firefighter memorial tower burn up and down in real time. It's right outside my window. The city of Austin has been a disaster on so many things, and the Senate and House were able to work together with some degree of speed to kind of ratchet down on those issues when it came to homeless camping in public spaces, making sure cities adequately fund law enforcement. So there were a lot of things that you would have thought were more difficult, that would have been more difficult to get through the legislature, that actually passed pretty easily this time. So buoyed by those, certainly challenges ahead in the special session, but hope to speak to all of that.
Yeah, excellent, Tyler. Thanks for that analysis. There are a few people in each state capital and in the nation's capital who truly understand the inner workings of the process. And it's imperative for folks on our side, right of center, to have folks like you who do understand that. So I really appreciate your perspective. What I want to do, gentlemen, is ask you one more question, and then we're going to get to audience questions, because I'm seeing several of them come through already, and they're excellent. And that question is, because I think in a lot of ways, this encapsulates what each of us is feeling and what I think those of us in Texas are thinking about the session. It is, okay, great job, productive session, thank you. Legislators have gone home probably for a few weeks. Timing of the special session is unknown. Governor Abbott, of course, alone makes that decision. And so we await that. But the point is, which topics need to be on the special session agenda in order to keep Texas Texan? Derek, what would you say?
Well, I'd say you'd have to start with what Governor Abbott has declared as his must-pass items, and that includes both election integrity and bail reform. We have the system of bail currently in Texas where, dangerous criminals are actually buying their way out at a fairly regular basis. In fact, just last year, we had a police officer slain by somebody who is granted bail in, I would say, a very haphazard way. So those two things absolutely must be. Now, other things that I think need to be added are going to be things that we saw among the priorities of both leadership in the House and Senate, but didn't seem to materialize much. And that includes both education reform. We had both a virtual bill, there was a charter bill as well, and they both tend to run into some pretty severe headwinds in the opposite chambers. So there's not a lot of, I would say, congruence on what that is going to, what that particular area is going to look like. But I would say that needs to be a prioritized item, is doing better by the children of our state as well, in addition to that which the governor has already identified. Yeah,
thanks for that, Derek. Russ, I know you're being posed this question and you're sitting outside Texas, but I would imagine, given the priorities of the Center for Renewing America, that you might want to make sure that we've got a Florida-style law on the transgender issue, that we do a little bit of cleanup on that critical race theory bill. It's a good bill, but it can be a great bill. Speak to that or any other issues that you think ought to be on the special session agenda.
Yeah, I think that the fact that Texas actually did pass a CRT bill, critical race theory, is a huge shot in the arm. For that not to have happened, you would have been able to make the national argument, well, this is facing headwinds in a place such as Texas, therefore we shouldn't do it in a place that's less red. So along those lines, I think it's really important to pass some of these bills that protect women's sports, that ensure that we're not doing healthcare procedures on children, and in a way that is benefiting LGBT influencers on Twitter, but not the benefit of the children. So I think that's one bucket of bills that's really important for Texas to be leading on. Obviously, election integrity, big tech reform is an area that is important from the standpoint of how do we ensure that we maintain our voice. So I really think of election integrity and big tech reform in the same vein as those reforms that can be thorny, but the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, is starting to point us to the way of how to put common carrier restrictions in place to make sure that everyone who has the benefit of our laws also has the duties to make sure that everyone's voice is maintained when it comes to some of those big tech platforms. And I think, to Kevin's point, trying to do as much as we can to make sure that civics is not used as a blanket way to get in some of the action civics, or all of us on this call, we hear civics and we think, oh, that's perfect. Well, the left has its own view of action civics that we need to be very careful that as we ban and oppose critical race indoctrination, state-sanctioned racism, that we don't open up the floodgates for something that is just as bad. So we need to make some tweaks on that one.
Yeah, thank you. Tyler, what would you add?
I think everything that y'all have mentioned has been great. There's two other ones that I really hope that the legislature will at least leave the option for, and that is providing more protections against COVID mandates. We did a great job of putting an amendment on a Click Colcourse bill that essentially bans vaccine passports in this state. I felt good from a procedural standpoint that Representative Click got that bill back to the House and opened it up as, here's the changes we made. Anyone want to fight about it? And House Democrats, not to criticize them too much, decided to just let the bill go, because I think they knew if it got opened for more conversation, the bill would get worse from their standpoint, that amendments were ready to be offered that would further ratchet down that policy. And I would have enjoyed that for sure. But it was good to see that on a voice vote in the Texas House, and certainly near unanimously, we were passing COVID mandate protections through the legislature without much of a fight, because I think people on the left were not ready to fight about that issue because they realized what a desperately losing issue that is. We did not get into law thanks to a bill that died on a procedural standpoint. A ban on employer mandates for COVID vaccines. I think we're on really good legal ground on that front. That will clearly go to a lawsuit if it hasn't already in the next 5 minutes. And I think we will win on that issue. But it would be nice to pass something about that during a special session, kind of leave that throttle open to look at where laws and leftist attempts to put those kind of things in place, where those are going, so we can do stuff about that. And on the same note, we saw as Senator Buckingham and Rep. Capriglione were passing bills to ban camping, and other people were passing stuff to ensure that law enforcement receives proper funding. We saw the number 2 at the Travis County DA's office had some emails exposed where she was looking for, I'll get the language wrong, but she was essentially trolling around looking for people who wanted to prosecute police. Should we prosecute police for misconduct? Of course we should. There's very public examples of that all the time. I understand that. But the police department in the city of Austin has been under siege, literally, for quite a long time now. We have severe attrition in the number of officers we have on the force. We're not training new classes, or we've just gotten back to doing that. And at every turn, APD is under siege. I'll just use that phrase again. And so we should leave the throttle open to look at what the city of Austin is doing, because keeping Texas, Texas, and the theme of the day here is, if you're going to move to Texas and enjoy the low tax environment, enjoy the responsible spending, enjoy the prosperity that we have, we're not going to turn our cities into left coast nightmares like we see on the East and West Coast, I suppose. And so we're going to have to pass laws and continue to adapt to what some cities are doing to try to be woke and stop that before it starts.
Yeah, man, that's so well said. And I'll just say for people outside Texas, outside Austin, that while the deterioration of the city has continued, that we're beginning to see the first 2 or 3 rounds of success because of some really well organized friends. A couple of them have been on this live stream. Mackenzie Kelly's on the city council, Matt Makoviak, who's really spearheading this. And I think that we're going to reclaim Austin. And it really leads into some of the questions that our audience members are asking, gentlemen, which are about activism and how individual people can get involved. I'm going to save those questions for a few minutes from now, because I want to stick with this line of thought here about what to do with a special session. I would add to your wonderful list property tax reform. I think it's one of the things that didn't get done this session. We got some really important bills done, and not to denigrate them, but more on the periphery. They're very important mechanical, structural bills. But I think, especially given the rate of appraisal growth of personal property here in Texas, that the taxpayer in Texas is expecting more. But I want to pitch this question to you, Russ. It comes from an audience member who is very astute, because they know that there's going to be a special session. They know that there's this so-called COVID relief money coming from Congress. And I guess they're leaning on your experience from having run the Office of Management and Budget. What advice would you give the governor, lieutenant governor, the Texas legislature on how to spend that COVID relief money in a special session?
I would obviously be very careful about developing a reliance on that money and spending aspect of state government that then requires you then to raise taxes down the road, because the government's not going to go away. So that would be one consideration, one filter that I would have for it. The second, I would be very loath to put it into places where the bureaucracy will spend it on woke activities. And I have education in mind there. One of my main concerns, with the Biden budget that was just passed, is that it's not just big government anymore. The government that is in our life is woke government. And when we talk about hundreds of billions of dollars going to the public school system now, what we're talking about is increasingly educational bureaucrats. And I don't know if you saw it on Twitter, but a good example of this just went viral in the last week, of a teacher in Oregon essentially saying, if you don't get on board with state-sanctioned racism as teachers, you're going to be found out and you're going to be fired. So, that's what we're funding when we put educational dollars and recycle it through the federal government back down to the COVID relief fund. So that would be, to the extent that you could plow it into infrastructure, is probably what I would put at the top of the list. But I'd have to know the particulars a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Russ. And as you and I have discussed, although not putting words in your mouth, this is Kevin and the Texas Public Policy Foundation saying this. We would love to see Texas take some of that infrastructure money and finish building the border wall. As Lord knows, Biden and Harris aren't doing a doggone thing about it. So from that question, which was excellent, so thank you to that audience member for doing it, to another question from the audience. Derek, I'm going to pitch this one to you. This audience member asks, what is the best way for everyone to stay informed on bills and knowing what is true versus what is just media and leftist lies?
Well, I think identifying the problem in the latter part of that question was key. There is a panoply of coverage options out there that tend to have a more factual basis. You know, the Texan springs to mind, that it got started up by Connie Burton, former state senator. But as far as
the Texan.news, is that their website?
Yes, I do believe so. But as far as following bills, I do have to put the caveat out there that especially when it comes to like Tyler was saying in the Senate, they subscribe to a more Pirates of the Caribbean understanding of they are more guidelines than actual rules. And then in the House, there's a lot of viability for things jumping from one bill to ideas jumping from one bill to another, whether it's in the amendment process or whether it's actually during a conference committee. And we saw a lot of reports come back seeking out of bounds resolutions and things like that got brought up before the adoption of the report. So what I would recommend people do is definitely go on TLO. That's the official website of the Capitol. And they offer a free tracking tool where you can set it up for alerts and whatnot. And that's available. It's available free. Unfortunately, unless you're as plugged into the level that Tyler is, you're probably not going to notice the procedural chicanery where you have ideas jumping from one bill to another. But the thing, I just summarize all that up and put that in the same box where, getting your information from only one source, even if it's one that does a good job of keeping their own bias and ideology out of their reporting, is a disservice to yourself. You probably should be consuming 2-3 similar sources on there, so you're covering the full gamut, including how things are being portrayed in a left-leaning media environment.
Yeah, really well said. Tyler, I'm going to come to you with the next question, but of course you can piggyback on that one if you like. But the question I want to pitch to you, different audience member, is they ask, is it fair to say that Republicans are hesitant on staying strong when it comes to social issues? And if so, why?
Yeah, the answer is yes, in all caps with an exclamation point. Again, my 7th session, I do plenty of campaigns and I get to be as hard right as I like in those. I do some lobbying. I do a lot of stuff around the Capitol where it requires a little more finesse, but I think everyone knows my reputation. I am who I am. But in my 7 sessions working for conservatives, we have this atmosphere of ready, set, lose. And we operate from a position of fear that our issues are scary or that most people aren't on board for this. Even to election integrity or the right to life and stuff like that. We operate from a position of fear. Certainly not this organization that I'm talking to today, but legislators can be a little afraid to pick up those tough battles because they don't want the bad headlines. They don't want to be treated unfairly. But sometimes you just got to lean into it. And so, yeah, they are hesitant to stay strong on those issues. They are hesitant to have those fights. Luckily, in the state of Texas, we have had the courage to do a lot. Sometimes when we look to other states like Florida, which is, I think, most of the time more purple than we are, you do have a legislature and a governor who many times, like ours, are ready to do the difficult things. And if you just do it, be bold and message it to people, you can have success. Unfortunately, I think Republican and conservative legislators around the country are often a little bit timid to take up those big battles. We encourage them. This group here encourages them a lot, gives them a lot of ideological backup, a lot of factual backup to do that. But yeah, unfortunately, Republicans are usually afraid to dive too far into those issues, and Democrats have absolutely no problem doing the exact opposite.
Yeah, and I'm sure Russ has seen this in his experience. I'll be coming to you in a minute, Russ, on a question about how people can get more involved. But I'll just say about this recently concluded session regarding legislation that was in the international news. There were some legislators who really distinguished themselves because they carried those really controversial but righteous ideas, those righteous bills, like Representative Steve Toth from the Woodlands north of Houston on critical race theory, Senator Brian Hughes from Northeast Texas, kind of in an emergency situation, had to pick up that bill because the bill author had gotten in a car accident, thank God, okay. But Senator Hughes had already carried the election bill. These guys knew, as we were talking to them, the left's going to demonize you anyway. It's going to be totally baseless. It's not going to be based on any fact. It's going to be really ugly rhetoric in ways we would never say about another person, including our political opponents. Just go ahead and get the hard stuff done because those barbs are coming. And so I guess I would say for those folks in Texas and outside Texas watching this, that I've seen more evidence of our guys and gals recognizing that and being willing to stand up than I have in certainly my career. We need more of them to do that. And I think that's the importance of organizations like ours, like Russ's, like many others, and having great mentors like Tyler at their sides. So guys, let me ask you one more question for all three of you before the final question. And this question from the audience member, it comes from several audience members, so you can see what's on people's minds. And basically it is, to paraphrase 3 or 4 questions. What steps can everyday citizens do to help in the next special session in Texas or in the next opportunity they have in their respective states? Russ, I'm going to start with you, given your long experience in working with grassroots folks around the country.
Sure. I mean, I talk about it in terms of, and I believe everyone can do this, whether you're at the beginnings of activism or whether you're a full-fledged leader of a grassroots coalition, but it's know, grow, and go. Know the issues. There is no substitute for knowing the issues. If you can't know all of them, know one of them. If you can't learn one of them, learn a portion of it and be so drilled down that people look to you increasingly for knowledge on that issue. Grow your networks, and that could just be as much of an email list that you send information to, and people look to you to figure out what's on his mind and what is he identifying that I can be educated, and then just go out and lead. I find that much of what we need in this country is not necessarily anything other than people putting in their own voice what they believe about the issues of the day, because you have an audience that Kevin will never have, you have an audience that I will never have, and you have an ability to sway them to your beliefs because you know them and you care about them and you love them, and you're going to think about how to best present that truth in a way that they can both grapple with it and potentially convince them. So really that's kind of what we teach at the Citizens for Renewing America, which is our activist arm. And we really try to make people like Tyler. We want people to know the policy, the politics, and the process, and those three and how they intertwine, because in that is how things happen or don't happen. And when you focus on just one of those three, you just come away with a distorted view of the art of the possible, and you end up not being able to be a good constituent to the member or the legislator who comes back and says, well, we weren't able to get it done. Well, here's why you weren't able to get it done. And next thing you know, that legislator goes back to Austin in this case, and they say, I'm never going back to my grassroots because they have way too much knowledge about how the process works.
Thank you. Derek?
Just allow me to say yes and to everything that Russ provided. And the thing I would add to it is that essentially one problem that we have, and I know this frustrates the grassroots to no end, is that there is institutional inertia in doing things always the way that it has been done. And there are organized interests against what it is that they are advocating for. You know, whether you're dealing with the trade associations or any sort of other organized interests, they have professional staff, some paid for by taxpayer dollars, that are actually advocating against what the citizen wants. And so I think it's important to know that, and again, not to add false urgency, but to know that there are groups out there that are pushing back against this. You know, we talk about property tax reform, we talk about certain changes to schools, and just assume because these are the best ideas that they'll just manifest themselves into reality, when in truth, they're pushing against all that institutional inertia. They're pushing against all that organization. And at the end of the day, it requires the grassroots to be plugged in. Now, allow me to say something that says yes, but you also need to have, if you were a grassroots activist or someone looking to become a vocal constituent up at the legislature, you need to have this almost indefatigable happiness about it. You know, we throw around happy warrior a lot, but you actually need to be able to take lumps on something you know in your heart of heart to be true, simply because of these interests aligned against it. You know, not everything will be a win, but just to Russ's point, is those incremental steps towards better policy are what in time add up to successful policy change.
Yeah, and we'll really, this session saw the fruit of that, what we like to call at our organization, radical incrementalism. In other words, you know, we'll go take a quarter of the enchilada. Doesn't mean that we're totally happy with that, but we're gonna take that, and we're coming back next session for the rest of it, or another quarter. It's what the left has done to our side for decades. And when we can get the whole enchilada, then let's take it. I mean, let's not think that incrementalism is a virtue, but I think it's a really important tactic. Tyler, what would you add?
Yeah, I think the original question was in the context of a special session. And if it wasn't, I'm going to make it about that for just a second. When I was a kid, I lived for a while in rural Colorado, and I lived very close to the Great Sand Dunes National Monument. And the first time I went there, you got to climb to the top of that sand dune, which was quite a hike for my 7-year-old legs, however old I was at the time. And I remember getting to the top of that first dune for the first time, and all of a sudden being educated that there was at least 100, if not 500 sand dunes of equal or greater height right behind it. That's what a regular session is I'm going to climb this mountain to get to the top on critical race or whatever issue. And then you climb that hill or hurdle that hurdle for that legislator or the opposition, and you realize that there's only 500 more to go before you get what you want. The good thing about a special session from the activist standpoint is there's very little tall grass. There's very little places to hide. The question is, what does the governor add to the agenda? And then there's a microscope on these folks, and the number of procedural tricks and, like I said, places to hide, to smother legislation become a whole lot smaller, and everyone's paying attention, and the timeline works out to pass the agenda items that the governor wants to pass. So there's the good news, is we'll get to put pressure on politely our elected officials in a special session, and there will be far fewer excuses or procedural things that can be done to kill important and hopefully all conservative priorities that we're going to have this summer or this fall, whenever we get around to it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate the time you've taken. I'm going to ask the final question of Russ, given his experience in the nation's capital. And Russ, that is, in spite of everything that the country has gone through over the last 18 months, you've had obviously a bird's eye view in much of that. Why did you wake up this morning optimistic about the future of America?
Well, because there's a sizable part of the country, about half of it, that's still fighting. And, you know, we've got 75 million people, and I believe more, that is incredibly devoted to the fight. And when you think about those kinds of numbers and the ability to, is, like I talked about, up to speed on the issues, and creating red sanctuaries in the 30 plus states where we have Republican governors and Republican legislatures. We've got a lot of opportunity, and the left has been working at this for about 100 years. People don't realize that they've been intentionally using minorities to push minority of voters, not minority demographics, but minority of voters to push incredibly unpopular ideas through every lever that they possibly can. And it's just in the last several decades that they've really started to get the temperature of the water to a boiling point. And so we have our work to do, But when we have the numbers that we have and the ideas that we have, and oh, by the way, our worldview reflects human beings as they are, not as we would like them to be. We have souls. We understand that we are created with a purpose. We're not changing the definition of human beings are. When our policies have been put in place, we don't have to point to places like Venezuela and Cuba and say that those are somehow anomalies. So look, everything is on our side other than the fact that we've got to be committed to it, and we've got to do it day in, day out. We got to build the right institutions, and we have to have a perspective in our political class. And I think this is really the thing that we've lacked. This is only in the last 10 years where the grassroots with the conservative movement has forced our leaders to have a what time is it perspective. And now that we're getting to that point where we have leaders who are rising up across the country to create these red sanctuaries, I think we're going to win in the next 2 and 4 years.
Man, no one could say it better. Thanks so much, Russ Vought, for that. Derek Cohen, Tyler Norris, thanks for taking time out of your schedules. You guys are so important to the future of Texas. Most of all, I know the three of you would join me in thanking our audience. These are the folks who really make our respective work possible. They're the reasons that we're all optimistic. And I'll just conclude this by saying, to use Russ's comment, what time is it in Texas? It's time for a special session to go finish the job. So let's go get it done. May the Lord prosper the work of your hands.